Hello, and welcome to the Jewish Heretics Podcast. This is the official podcast of the United Jewish People's Order. We are a secular, progressive Canadian Jewish organization that's been around since the 1920s. My name's David Wall, and I am the community's cultural programmer. I will be your host today. For this, the 15th episode of our podcast, I had the great honor of speaking to author, professor, and activist Naomi Klein. Naomi is an award-winning journalist and New York Times best-selling author of such books as No Logo, The Shock Doctrine, This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate, and most recently, Doppelganger, A Trip into the Mirror World. She is a columnist with The Guardian. In 2018, she was named the inaugural Gloria Steinem Endowed Chair at Rutgers University. In September 2021, she joined the University of British Columbia as UBC Professor of Climate Justice and co-director of the Center for Climate Justice there. She is a regular media commentator in print, radio, and television around the world, appearing on such shows as BBC Newsnight and Hard Talk, Democracy Now!, The Rachel Maddow Show, The Colbert Report, and many others. She has been interviewed and profiled in hundreds of magazines, newspapers, and podcasts, including a major profile in the New Yorker magazine where she was called, quote, the most visible and influential figure on the left, what Howard Zinn and Noam Chomsky were 30 years ago, unquote. She's been ranked as one of the world's top 100 public intellectuals in Prospect magazine and as one of the 100 people who are changing America in Rolling Stone. On top of all of that, she is one of the most vocal and visible proponents of a principled leftist Jewish ethos who has spoken out on behalf of Palestinian rights and human rights in general and against the genocidal statements and actions of Israel and Zionism. We reached Naomi at her home in Vancouver. Naomi Klein, thanks so much for agreeing to be on the Jewish Heretics podcast. How are you today?
I'm good. I'm happy to be talking to you, Dave.
That's nice to hear. And you're zooming in from Vancouver, where you live.
I am, yeah.
Before we jump in, I think we should do a full disclosure, which is that you and I are not strangers.
No, we're not.
Yeah,
we're very good friends.
I think we've known each other for 30 years.
Yeah, you sang at my wedding.
I sang at your wedding. So I don't think this is going to be sort of objective journalism. I think it's going
to be really hard hitting.
All right, yeah, it's going to be really hard. Yeah. So let's begin. So if there's any kind of focus to this podcast, it's that we're exploring ways that progressive people express their Jewishness, their heretical Jewishness. And so I'd like to start with where you got your Jewish superpowers from. And when I asked Avi, I interviewed him last year.
Yeah.
We talked about what we call his yichus. Yichus is Yiddish for, bit hard to translate, but it means kind of starry lineage. And you have that too. Your parents are famous.
I
think they are. I think that maybe not the same, but you have yichus as well. And so I'd like to start off asking a kind of two-part question. Because you and I share certain things about our childhoods. Number one is that we grew up in progressive households, progressive Jewish households. But there's a major divergence that happens, which is that you end up going to Hebrew school.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have any of that.
The thing is like we did both grow up in lefty Jewish families who were part of the wave of Americans, right, who came to Canada during the Vietnam War. But I think now that I know more about our families, I would say that mine were like total bourgeois sellouts compared to Naomi Wall.
You don't mind.
Yeah,
you don't know my father. You don't know my father.
Right. But no, I do know your father. I said Naomi. But my parents came to Canada during the Vietnam War. They were war resistors. My dad was a deserter. He did not want to go. It was a complicated case, but bottom line, he didn't want to be a doctor in the army in Vietnam.
Mm.
And so they came to Canada and had a relatively smooth transition. It worked out really well for them in that they both worked in the public sector. My father was part of um, the like natural childbirth movement, in Canada that brought midwives and doulas into hospitals and really advocated against medicalization of birth. So that was a big part of. Yes, it was Jewish, it was feminist. And my mom worked for the National Film Board and made documentary films, very sort of second wave educational films.
Mm.
So yeah, and I grew up in Montreal, but then they moved out to Vancouver, which is how I ended up here. Um, but yeah, all of our extended family was still in the US because they were draft dodgers, which I think was true
Right.
for you too. Like my grandparents on both sides. Eventually they came and lived in Canada, um, but everybody was in the States other than us, other than
Mm.
our little nuclear family for all of my childhood.
Did they talk about when you were little? Was Israel and Palestine talked about in the home?
Um,
I asked this because it
yeah,
wasn't in my home. It
yeah,
wasn't
yeah.
discussed.
So
Even
I
with
should say, I
yeah.
mean, I think I had a very my father's family was left wing, like multi-generation. My grandparents were communists. My father's mother and father were very active. Um, and that was a big part of the reason why my father couldn't go through the process of becoming a conscientious objector. Like I think he started it, but then realized that he would have to sort of be interrogated to prove that, and that would involve these sort of like, because my grandfather had suffered under McCarthyism, it didn't seem like he didn't want to prove his left-wing bona fides, because that sort of, I think, felt like snitching,
Mm.
um, because my grandparents were part of a left-wing, community that was under FBI surveillance and all this stuff. So anyway, it was just made more sense to leave. My mother's family side was completely different, like much more conventional, no, not a shred of left-wing politics. Um, and so they met in the 60s, and she had a kind of political awakening in the 60s and became, part of this, movement of, anti-war movement, feminist movement. But there was always a very big difference between the stories that I heard from my mother's side of the family and the stories I heard from my father's side of the family. And I think my mom felt an attachment to Israel. It wasn't a huge part of our home life, though.
Mm.
We never talked about it at home, but we did go to Israel when I was 3. Like, I don't really have a memory of it, but they went. So they weren't like anti-Zionist. I don't know why, honestly, they took us to Israel in 73. There are photos of it. So it's like, I don't know if I have memories or it's like one of those things. My father took a lot of photographs of my childhood, and most of my memories are actually just like photographs. I'm
Yeah, I
like,
get it.
do I remember that? I had some memory of floating in the Dead Sea. Um, but yeah, I did go to Hebrew day school starting in kindergarten. So Israel was absolutely part of like my childhood, and in that these were Zionist schools, right? In completely woven into the education. And that was, I think my parents had arguments about it. And my mom wanted, like, she felt, I think because my father was secular and we were living in this place that was totally new to her, right? She came to Canada pregnant with my brother, and then I was born in Montreal, and so is my brother Seth. But she was building a community for her family, and she was very, I think, concerned that we wouldn't feel Jewish unless she made certain decisions. So she was adamant that we go to shul, like, we went to a Reconstructionist synagogue pretty regularly. I mean, certainly for the holidays and a fair bit. And she was active in the synagogue. My dad never went to synagogue. it was always kind of like a war zone between them. Like it would be like, my dad would go buy bagels on Passover just to annoy her and stuff,
Right, right.
Um, and there was a push and pull, but she wanted us to go to Hebrew day school, to maintain this connection to what it means to be Jewish. But there was a huge culture clash between our family and the school, not just over Israel, over everything. Like, because it was a very, the students were, and most of the families were not only not left wing, but like very, very conventional bourgeois business.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people in the schmata business in Montreal. It was a very materialistic school, so like there was always a lot of conflict because they'd sent me to this school, but then at home they would be like, my dad'd be like, he'd constantly call my friends Japs and me a Jap.
Wow.
And then my mom would scream at him about it. And I was like, well, you sent me to this school. Anyway, it was conflicted.
And can you talk about how this kind of education shaped your identity as a young person? I mean, it must have had enormous effect on you. For example, did you end up having Zionist proclivities as you got older?
I did go to Israel when I was 16 as part of this kind of lefty camp called Interlochen. But it wasn't lefty about Palestinians. I mean, it was progressive except Palestine in Israel. So it wasn't one of these teen tours. It was a strange experience. The first Intifada was about to start, and I have this very vivid memory of the camp was on a university campus that was closed. Sometimes they turn them into like summer camps in the dorms, and I remember being in the swimming pool, and on the other side of the chain link fence, there was a funeral and people were wailing. And it was very strange. Like, we were in the swimming pool and there was this funeral that was clearly a really big deal, but we didn't know anything about it. And they told us that we shouldn't go into town anymore because things were very tense. So I knew there was, like, I was 16 at the time, and or 15, and I definitely knew that the camp was bullshit because they described it as an exchange, a cultural exchange between Canadians, Americans, and Israelis. And it was like, well, where? And I knew enough to ask, why aren't we talking to Palestinians? Like, what is going on? And and so things were really heating up. And this would have been 86, 87, the latest. And then I went back in 88 with my mom after she had a stroke. She had a stroke when I was 17, and she had a couple of films in a film festival in Israel, a women's film festival, and she needed somebody to accompany her because she was in a wheelchair, and so she needed an attendant. So I went with her on that trip, and that was the real eye-opener for me. So I was 18, and it was a different way to go to Israel because we were meeting all these feminist activists. Like, at the time, women in Black were really strong in Israel, and they would have these vigils. They were kind of like the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, and we met all of these feminists, Palestinian and Israeli, who talked about these incredibly high levels of domestic violence, talked about the occupation. So we met like these women who were part of Women Against the Occupation, like groups like your mom had been involved in Canada, right? But it was more like the kind of travel that I would eventually do later, like after No Logo came out, where I would come to a city and immediately meet like the best activists, right? Because I'd written this book that was important to movements. And so immediately I would just get like a backdoor key to the city. And that's what happened when I went with my mom when I was 18. And I was completely horrified by it. And so when I So I guess the short answer is like, I never had a moment of like idealism. There was like a pro forma thing of buying trees at my elementary school, and there were songs like Hatikva, but I never had any. It was like just a thing that my school did. I didn't feel a personal connection to it, and it wasn't reinforced at home.
Yeah, so you
Um,
didn't buy it.
yeah.
You didn't buy in at any time. You were always
No, I
questioning.
would say I had it. I'm glad, like I was exposed very intensely to a conventional um, narrative about Jewish suffering, genocide, and the redemption story about Israel as kind of reparations for the Holocaust. I got that story at school, right? Like the way we heard about the Holocaust was, what my friend Cecily Saratsky calls like re-traumatization, or now I've come to think of more as prosthetic traumatization because it wasn't my trauma in the first
Of
place.
course.
But I remember going to an exhibition with my elementary school when we were like in grade 3 or 4, and they, took us to this little community center with like where there were piles of shoes, and we heard these horror stories about, making lampshades out of human skin and things like that, which I don't think was true. Like we were really made to be terrified at like ages 8, 9. Was really into reading like books about the Holocaust involving children. It started with Anne Frank, but then I just couldn't get enough. I would just read anything I could, like, stories of kids hiding in the woods and things like that. My first diary was named after Anne Frank's diary. It's really what made me want to be a writer. So I was very interested in the Holocaust, like a lot of Jewish kids, but I think I received a universalist message about it
Mm.
at home, that this is never again to anyone. It's about fighting racism. But at school, I got the narrative structure of the Holocaust is a plot point on the way to the promised land, and never again means never again because of Israel. And now everybody's saying Hatikva. So I'm grateful that I got that double vision, that I wasn't fully in it, because then I think it's hard to get out. You're so emotionally invested, but I feel like I need to understand that story to, talk to a lot of people who are in the process of like unlearning a lot of things that weren't true. But my unlearning process mainly happened when I went there with my mom at 18, and then the first intifada was really broke out in force. When I was in university, we did a special issue on the occupation, and I wrote a very controversial article, which made me a figure of hate for the campus Hillel. So, like, I've been in these fights for a really, really
Really
long
long time.
time.
It's almost like you've been privileged. You were privileged to receive that education because you saw inside the beast in a way that made, like, I certainly have not. I remember witnessing.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. I think if you grow up in a truly anti-Zionist household, and you have parents who, really live their values and don't send you to the summer camps and the schools where you get that other story, then you don't really understand its force, the force of it. Luckily, my family were hypocrites.
yeah. Good
My
thing.
parents are going to listen to this. That's the
Yeah,
terrible part.
I'm sure they're
But
used to it. I'm sure they're
they
used
do
to it.
really have we live with contradiction.
Yeah. Well, we all do. So I want to, and actually, all of this could be related to your book Doppelganger, which came out last year,
Mm.
and that Angela Davis thinks is awesome, and others, and it is awesome. I read it, and I found it to be really compelling, and like it was a page turner, but also really illuminating. Um, so I listened to David Naiman, your 5 hours of interview on Between the Covers, which was incredible, and he calls it your most Jewish book, which
Mm.
I suppose it is. But I think that's because, I mean, I would say it's more personal. It's more about you than your other books. It feels memoirish at times. Um, but I also see it as a like a culmination of all your work. It's like a summing up. All the themes of everything going back to No Logo are in it.
Yeah.
Can you talk about the process that led to its writing, and
Mm.
why are you compelled to be so personal this time around?
When I first started writing, I would often write personally. And my first book, No Logo, which I wrote in my 20s, it it has personal sort of embarrassing confession throughout.
Yes, it does,
At one point I called it a mall rat memoir, and meets investigative journalism, right? It's very much like not taking myself too seriously, and I'm investigating these like sweatshop labor and human rights abuses in Nigeria by these shiny logos. But I'm also saying, like, as a kid, I wanted to like crawl inside of them. I was in this state of intense longing because of the thing I talked about of like being like this duality of growing up in this hippie family that was very judgmental about the 1980s, consumer culture, but being sent to this school where it was purely a celebration of it. Like the kids would come to school and talk about what kind of car their parents had and things like that, and everybody was so conscious of what brands people were wearing. So I wrote about desperate, like wanting to have like a Lacoste shirt so badly that I like sewed one on to like a generic shirt,
Right. Right.
And there was like a girl at my school who would check the labels, like make sure that no one was cheating, like she would turn up people's collars.
Yes.
Her name was Romy.
Yeah, you remember.
Like that is the kind of school it was.
Yeah.
So I think I had a lot of fun writing No Logo, and I used to, when I was a younger writer, before I wrote that book, my writing was funnier, right? Like you remember, Dave,
Yes,
like I wrote a pop culture column, and I think what happened is that I got incredibly lucky and blessed with my first book, and it became this kind of runaway bestseller. And I suddenly was like the voice of like the anti-corporate globalization movement. And I felt like that meant that I had to be very careful and very serious suddenly, right? And so I just sort of felt like I was carrying the weight on my shoulder. Like I couldn't fuck up. And it was a really gotcha kind of media culture around me. Like there was like a column in the National Post, a short-lived column in the National Post I think it was by Mark Stein, called Klein Watch, where they would just try to catch me going
remember,
to a Starbucks.
Did they go through your garbage? Did they go through your garbage?
They went through my garbage. Remember when they went through my garbage to like find Diet Coke cans? And like, I mean, I would not go into a Starbucks for a good 20 years, not because I had ethics, but because I was scared. And I just remember there one day when I was like in an airport and desperately needed a coffee, and I realized no one gave a shit anymore.
Yeah.
But it was like, that's how paranoid I was. And I think it had a really negative effect on my writing voice. I don't mean to diss the shock doctrine or this changes everything, but they weren't really, that's not me. Like, me, I don't take myself that seriously. And I, even though I'm proud of that work, I didn't have fun writing that. I didn't feel like I was really writing in my own voice. So I think during the pandemic, I realized that I had time to try to refine the writer who I want to be now. Like I felt a sort of sense of liberation, like I'm no longer the voice of the left, like it's okay, there's lots of other people and I can just be the writer I want to be. So I started working with a writing teacher. And so the reason it's personal is just like it was my goal to just write, to just reunite my true self with my writing voice, if you know what I mean, right? Like, and I do think that, and that's why I read the audiobook myself, and it was easy to read because it is actually the way I talk. So, yeah, I don't know. That was a long answer.
No,
it's
good.
Saying, why does it have to be so? Why is it so personal? I mean, it's a book of creative nonfiction. So I was working with this writing coach named Harriet Clark, and we were just kind of playing with form. And I was just trying to just sort of see what I could do as a writer beyond the linear nonfiction form, and just kind of play with dialogue and just play with like getting at things more elliptically. And part of that was that I wanted to have more fun as a writer, but part of it was that I was also having a kind of a political crisis. When I started working on the book in 2020, 2021, 2022, where I think I was profoundly politically depressed, to be honest with you. I had been very active in the Bernie Sanders campaign. We all know how that ended. Then there was a moment where we thought, okay, people are learning some lessons from this pandemic, and they want to like respect workers, and they're appreciating the fact that the air is cleaner and that there's more time in nature and that we're moving more slowly. Those of us who are privileged enough to, not be on the front lines, and remember those idealistic days when there's sort of all these kind of resolutions. We made a little film called Message from the Future, The Years of Care and Repair, which Imagine was working with Molly Crabapple, who I know you've interviewed. And it was sort of imagining how we could come out of the pandemic changed for the better, learning the lessons. And it just became clear that none of that was going to happen. Things were churning back to a poisonous, almost worse than normal, and there have been a lot of these moments politically where it's like, I think of them as these kind of like these almost like these sort of half portals. Like it almost happened. I felt that way on the Bernie campaign. I even felt that way after the financial crisis, where, all the movements of the squares and people were really deeply critiquing capitalism. And it really felt like, wait a minute, are we going to actually change here? Like, are we really, is this going to be it? And then with Bernie, like I felt like, there were moments on the campaign where, I'd be speaking to some huge stadium that because we were his warm-up act, right? And I was a surrogate for the campaign talking about the Green New Deal. But I remember being in some massive stadium. Where would it have been? Probably Nevada. And just feeling my ancestors on my shoulders, like my blacklisted grandfather and my draft dodging father, war resistor father. And like, they could never have imagined like a Jewish, like democratic socialist getting this close to the presidency. We thought we were going to win, like when Bernie won Nevada, we thought we were going to win. I mean, I let myself hope, and so I had my heart broken. I had my heart broken by that and by the way that the left started eating itself after the 2020 uprisings and Biden coming to office. Like that was another moment, the racial justice uprisings that summer, where it was like, wow, like, are people changing? Like, is this combination of forces, like the slowness of the pandemic and the fact that it showed our enmeshment so viscerally, right? Because we had to think about, well, who's breathed this air, who packed this box? Like it made visible the lie of the lone individual at the heart of capitalism. And so that was another moment where I think a lot of us thought, like, is it happening? Is it this moment? And so I think when all of those sort of almost revolutions, fell away, I found myself no longer able to believe in the conceit of a thesis-based argument book of nonfiction that marshals the evidence and the case for why we should do these things. Because I just didn't believe I just didn't believe in it anymore, right? So I sort of started playing with form, in part because I just couldn't bring myself to write that kind of book. I lost faith in the idea that facts and arguments change things. Yeah. So there you have it.
I mean, I would argue, and of course, this, there is a grand, or there's more than one grand thesis in Doppelganger about, the social media AI era, the taking corporatization and disaster capitalism to the sort of steroid level insanity.
Right, and it's also about the way we have ourselves been colonized by capitalism, and I believe that's why our movements fell apart. Right, like I wanted to write critically about us, right? Because I wanted to understand why we keep failing. And I knew that I couldn't do that wagging my finger from the outside, right? So that's the other answer to why it's so personal. Like I had to cop to my own brand concerns, like to my own.
Yeah.
And so like having a doppelganger, Naomi Wolf, who, one of the working titles of the book was Off-Brand Me. And just sort of playing with, so I feel like part of the reason why our movements have not achieved their potential is because they often get kind of hijacked by the politics of personal branding, where a few people are just playing the attention economy game really well and often lead these movements off cliffs. And then leaves a huge amount of resentment and sorrow behind. And as one of the first activists who kind of got called a brand, in that 1990s sort of the era of the personal brand, like that's what happened to me after No Logo. I thought, well, maybe we can look at this as a system, so it's not about it's not about calling out this person or that person, but it's like we are in the matrix, like we are in the system. And I think that, it means that we need to build real structures again, right? Like I don't think there's no escape from it, but I don't think we can have movements based on, social media traffic and online influencers. Like there has to be accountability, there has to be transparency, there has to be democracy, like within our movements. And this is something I talk about a ton with, Keeanga-Yamada Taylor, who's, been writing about Black Lives Matter for many years. And has talked about this very issue of the sort of failure of democracy within the movement, right? And I don't think and I think it's been true of the climate movement, right? Like, and it's not a way to run a movement, to just have it be like whoever has the biggest Twitter account.
Yeah.
So luckily, Elon Musk has destroyed Twitter. And a lot of people are now coming to the conclusion that we should do more offline organizing.
Yeah. Another thing you talk about in Doppelganger, which I think is apt, is how the right sees these failures on the left and then co-opts the methods and the ideas of the left to achieve much more.
Yeah.
Which is
because they don't have any ethics.
Exactly. I want to talk. In the spirit of your personalization of your writing career, I want to begin with a confession and then get you to respond to it and sort of bring things back into a Jewish realm.
I haven't been very Jewish.
Yeah, I was sort of hoping for more. Oh well. So I heard an interview with Omar Al-Akkad, who's a great writer, who just, I guess his first nonfiction book came out called One Day Everyone Will Have Been Against This. And he asked the question, is there anything salvageable about Western culture, the lineage of Western democracy, so-called enlightened the Western world? And in a sense, he's given up on the West in the wake of the devastation of Gaza and the willful blindness of so-called enlightened Western nations. And I admit that some days I have a similar feeling about my Jewishness. Is there anything salvageable about Jewish identity? What's left for us? Even I would say that right now you and I have a progressive space here, a progressive Jewish space. But it starts to feel insular, almost narcissistic or boring for me sometimes, and I get sick of it. And I'll give you an example and then let you respond. So the United Jewish People's Order, where I work, we're bringing Peter Beinart to Toronto in May. Peter Beinart's written his book, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza. And he'll inevitably be, and I think it's great. I think he's wonderful in many ways, editor-at-large at Jewish Currents, and, he is, a really important voice. But he'll inevitably be, at our event, he'll be speaking to a room full of Jews about Jewishness, trying kind of to salvage an ethical, positive Jewishness for the 21st century. That seems to be his goal. And I wonder, is it worth it? What is there left to celebrate? Do you see a Jewish future that's positive or necessary? And what does that look like? How's about that for a question?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a really personal question. And I mean, I ask myself, in moments of bleakness, when I see, I mean, particularly when I see Jewishness being used as the cudgel to attack, hard-won victories for racialized people. You know, at the Toronto School Board, at at universities, and this is a very complicated story because I think that the backlash against the gains of movements for decolonization, for equality, against anti-Black racism, like all these movements have won, important measures that were never, the sum total of what the movements were demanding by any means, but it was always, as Martin Luther King Jr. said, like on the cheap, like it's easier to desegregate than to fund schools and to actually do reparations, right? And that's always been the way, is that, capitalism finds the cheapest way to seem to be doing something, right? Which is always sort of the kind of the representation at the top, right? But I still think that a lot of those changes did matter, and did bring important perspectives into mainstream discourse that wouldn't have been there. And I think that what we're seeing now is a counter revolution. Like I've referred to it as a counter revolution without the revolution, like we never had the full, revolution, but we are getting the full force of a backlash. And I think it would have happened anyway. Like, and here I'm talking about, these ferocious attacks on DEI in the States, which are going to come to Canada, and are already starting. But often, like Palestinian solidarity cast as support for October 7th, support for Hamas, is used as the kind of wedge, right? And there's a particular kind of bleakness and horror in watching Judaism be used for that. And I have seen this, I've been sort of tracking this for a long time. I wrote a huge piece many years ago for Harper's about the Durban anti-racism conference that happened in 2001, which was the closest that Black people and colonized people the world over ever came to there being a serious conversation about reparations for enslavement and colonialism. It was a huge, huge moment. It happened right before September 11th. The conference ended in Durban on September 9th. So it's kind of lost to history. I quoted Bill Fletcher saying it was like somebody pressed a giant delete button, but it's hard to remember how much momentum there was for a real discussion around reparations. And then what derailed it was these allegations that the whole conference was an anti-Semitic hate fest because a couple of anti-Semitic cartoons were found at the counter conference, right? And that was not why Western governments wanted to walk out of that conference. They wanted to walk out of that conference because they didn't want to pay reparations, but they used these allegations of anti-Semitism as the wedge, as the way in, right? And we're seeing that over and over and over again. So those are the moments where I feel bleakest, where Judaism is actively being used to take away other people's rights, in so many ways. And that's not even engaging with the way Judaism is weaponized against Palestinians in Palestine. But I'm not with you, I guess is what I would say, Dave, because I also feel that one of the weaknesses of the left is that we are overly material. when in my studies of the right, and I've been studying the right for a long time, right? And that's what the shock doctrine was about. And I studied climate change deniers, and Doppelganger, led me to listen to hundreds and hundreds of hours of Steve Bannon and other MAGA media. And what is clear is that part of the power that they're able to marshal is the power of myth, is the power of these kind of epic stories, right? And I'm ambivalent about it because I don't, like many of the stories are horrific, in the Old Testament, but there's also some power in them, and one of the most powerful political moments that I have participated in was, almost exactly a year ago when JVP and If Not Now organized a Seder in the streets in New York City outside Chuck Schumer's place in Brooklyn, and there were thousands of people there, and we had an actual Seder in the streets on the second night of Passover. We did the rituals, and I gave a speech called Exodus from Zionism, and for the first time invoked some of these stories, right? Talked, like, actually engaged with the biblical text and kind of made it my own, made it meaningful tried to make it meaningful for this political moment. And the response to that speech was like nothing I've ever experienced in my writing life. I mean, the Turkish translation alone was viewed millions of times, and what was interesting about the reaction, I mean, and obviously it wasn't all good, but I mean, what was interesting about the reaction was like how much it resonated in, the Arabic speaking world, precisely because it engaged with scripture, and that experience has made me realize there's something there, there's something there that's worth not just seeding. And I feel a tremendous love and kinship and Hamishness with these new, like the amount of like intense new friendships that I have formed with people at Jewish Currents, who I didn't know before this year, or David Naiman, who you mentioned, a lot of us have found each other. You and I we've had this bond for a long time, but I feel like the bonds are greater. I'm so grateful to JVP for having built a community and a container. I'm so grateful to Jewish Currents, and anybody who's building institutions that allow us to find each other, that are non-exclusive, that are about collective liberation and being in solidarity with other movements. And I feel like that's my home. It feels as close to a political home as I've ever felt outside of the Bernie Sanders campaign.
Yeah. No,
which was a little Jewish too, by the way.
This is lovely to hear, and of course I agree with you. I was being I was in my darkest. I was giving that sort of a peering into my darkest moments as a Jewish person.
But no, I mean, I appreciate you saying it, because I do wonder, like in those bleak moments. Look, I have Christian friends who have a practice, who for whom faith is important. Catholic friends, who feel the same way when they see their religion weaponized. And I actually think we need a cross-faith movement that is about disentangling our respective spiritual practices from the nation state. And I think that that's a particular practice that we need as Jews, and that's what I've called the Exodus from Zionism. But my goodness, a lot of like Christians need to do that. Like, how entangled can a faith and a government be than looking at what Trump is doing with, putting Christian Zionists into charge of the military and, Israel policy, But even if you think about the way the Canadian state has entangled Indigenous spiritual practices with our state, and the Indian Act, right?
Yeah.
Like, I actually think this is something that could unite a lot of us. And I'm always thinking, like, what can be connective tissue that can build like durable, powerful coalition, that are not just about like the politics of deference and allyship, but really about like collective investments in a project of the need for our spiritual practices to be decolonized from these nation states.
Wow, it's interesting, because I was going to ask you for a bit of advice. I work at United Jewish People's Order, it's been around for 100 years. It's a secular, at a certain point in our history, not that long ago, staunchly
Yeah.
secular left progressive, with roots in communism,
Yeah.
socialism, the Bundists, and yet I see, when I talk to younger members of our community, the future seems in a kind of progressively imbued spirituality. That's where the future seems.
Mm-hmm.
Younger
Yeah.
people I talk to who are right on side politically want a spiritual component. It's very hard to define exactly what that is, but
Yeah.
one of the most amazing
Yeah.
people in a community is a Kohenet, which is, a trained female priest in Judaism. And that would have, that would go completely against the ethos of UJPO, United Jewish People's Order, as recently as 15 years ago, and yet that seems to be the future. And I asked Ariel Angel, who you wonderfully put me in touch with, what her advice was. She said it was almost like she said, "Duh! In order to have a future as a progressive organization, you need to have a spiritual component." Now, exactly how that's defined, I don't know. And so
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think Ariel is in a very similar space, because Currents has that secular history, the strain, the Bunda strain, that was sort of part of a liberation project from the kind of Hasids, right? I guess, or from like a very kind of oppressive interpretation of the faith.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's an evolution. That's not our battle. Like, we need to free. We need, like Ariel says, like, if you're gonna, the fact is, challenging Zionism as the default ideology, utterly entangled with Judaism, means that people following their ethics and opposing genocide, a genocidal state, means that they're going to lose their synagogue, summer camp, possibly large parts of their family. A friend of mine, who I don't have permission to name her, and talked about losing limb after limb of their family tree. And that's one of the great privileges of coming from a lefty family, is my politics haven't cost me nearly as dearly as so many people,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I think that, as Ariel says, like, if you're going to ask people to accept those severings, you better have some more containers to hold them. Like, there better be something on the other side that can fulfill the needs that they were getting by going to the synagogue and be their new family. And I mean, hopefully people are not losing their families forever, but a lot of people are, right?
Mm-hmm.
So but I also increasingly feel, and I've talked about this with Molly, that here-ness, doikat, is a spiritual stance. It's not a religious stance in the sense of, like, it's not scripture-based, but committing to home, to place, and to making here better. At a time of climate crisis and insane billionaires in AI who have various visions of exodus from our collective reality, whether it's like sucking up all the water and energy to build their AI machines and upload their consciousness, or colonizing Mars, or building their fortresses from the fires that they themselves are unleashing. That is the theirs. They're all, some of them call themselves tech Zionists, because they, Peter Thiel et al., they have no desire to be in collective here-ness with the rest of humanity. What their wealth is for is buying them out of the fires that they themselves have unleashed. So when I say I like connect with here-ness, that means connecting with my fellow living beings in this miracle that is this world. And I think that we need to imbue here-ness with a deep and profound, like mythic spirituality, like, and a lot, I mean, that is like indigenous cosmologies have that. Every culture, if you go back far enough, had such, like, imbued the natural world with such sacredness, right? And I think that is part of the work. And I think as a Jewish person, I want to do that work drawing on Doikat, but everybody in the world has a lineage they can draw from if they do their research, like Pope Francis, bless him, he is ill and I worry about him. And I don't agree with him on everything, but I love that he called himself Francis, that he called himself after the saint who preached to birds and flowers and said, the moon is your sister, like, and his encyclical on ecology is an attempt, right, to reconnect Catholicism with some of those roots. So I think in an age of climate, you know, breakdown and where more and more of the planet is going to become uninhabitable, and so many people more people are going to be on the move and needing to find a here that will welcome them. Like, that's my faith, that's my spirituality, and it's not just political. Like, it's very, like, if you really commit yourself to it, you're committing yourself to spiritual practice.
Wow, that's
I see these people as traitors to this to this world, like traitors to, like, the traitors to creation, traitors to the wonders of this world. This idea that you would let it burn, and just try to have a fortress or dream of going to another planet. Like, that's, to me, the most profound betrayal. So I want to be able to speak in the language, like in a prophetic voice about this, because I think we need to wake people the fuck up. Like, it is so dire, And I don't think we can do that just by saying, like, hey, we're about offering green jobs. Like, I've tried that for 20 years, Like, I think there's some of that, but I think we have to go deeper, is what I'm saying. I think the times call for it. So we have to use whatever ancient tools we can.
Wow, that was profound. Thank you. Um,
I'm trying this out. I ran it by Molly, and she said, "Yeah, doikot for everyone."
Yeah, doikot as spiritual practice.
Yeah,
I think it's wonderful. So we have time for one more brief question, I think.
this is what happens when you move from Toronto to British Columbia.
I was going to say, it sounds, this is a new Naomi. I like this new Naomi.
It happens.
As they say, preach. Preach. No, but it was advice for our organization ultimately, which is, and we know we're headed in that direction, kind of more of a spiritual embrace.
Yeah, and I really think there's something in this multi-faith disentangling from these militarized ethno-states, right? I mean, like, the United States has become a Christian ethno-state before our eyes, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Israel-Palestine, is there a utopian or moving towards utopian vision of what it could be? What would it look like? What is possible, and or what would you like to see Israel-Palestine look like? What's the structure of it? Is there an Israel part of it? Is it a one democratic state? What does a utopian vision of Palestine look like?
I guess, honestly, I don't feel like it's, I mean, I have certain beliefs, that are core to my politics, that are pretty normy, like, I believe in basic equality and basic human rights. So, and that's not special to Israel. Like, my problem with Israel is always that it's claimed a right to an exception from the Universal Declaration that was born out of on human rights, that was born out of the fires of the Holocaust. So it's like, I'm just hesitating because I feel like part of my role as a non-Zionist diaspora Jew is to disentangle myself from this ethno-state that is not, I don't feel I have a right to dream its future, right? I don't live there, I never have. But I will say about Israel that what I will say about everywhere in the world, which is that I believe in the equality of every single human on this planet. So whatever the quote unquote solution is, it has to involve full equality. I don't believe in segregation. I have these normie beliefs in the much maligned international humanitarian legal architecture that bans genocide, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, and says that all lives are of equal value, that guarantees the right of refugees to return, the right of refugees to seek safety. All of that needs to apply, But in terms of the particularities, you mentioned Peter, I think Peter Beinart has much more of an investment and a history with the state of Israel and has a spiritual practice that has more of an investment in the Hebrew language. My heritage is more entangled with Yiddish, So it's just not my, I think part of investing in here is to say, that's not my dream to dream, right?
Yeah.
Which is not to say it's not my problem. When genocide is committed in my name, that's my problem, right? In the name of fighting antisemitism or another Holocaust. That's my problem. But it's not my dream to dream any more than any other place that I don't live is not my dream to dream, right? Beyond those universal rights that I still believe in, even as they are revealed to have never been fully applied or existed in the first place. I think they were a good idea and we should try it. It's like Astra said about democracy. Astra Taylor, democracy doesn't exist, but we'll miss it when it's gone. I feel that way about the international humanitarian legal architecture. I think I would like us to try it out, for real. I want to be part of a movement that actually tries real democracy at the UN, which means getting rid of the vetoes at the Security Council. We've seen all the things that fail. And maybe Trump's global rampage will convince, enough countries to get together and try to do, multilateralism for real. Who knows?
Let's give it a spin.
Let's give it a spin.
Naomi, thanks so much for this.
Don't knock it till you try it.
Thanks for this wonderful conversation.
Oh, it's so good to talk with you.
Well, we've come to the end of our show. We'd like to thank you for listening, and we'd like to thank everyone who made our podcast possible, including United Jewish People's Order Executive Director Serena Sarin, and of course our guest, Naomi Klein. This podcast was recorded at Walt Whitman Studios in Toronto. The theme music was composed by Serena Sarin with help from me. I'm David Wall. Until next time, seid gesund.